He's a paying customer just like you. Lisa's voice rang out sharp and unwavering as she defended the lone biker from the devil's Nomads against the harassment of local cops. Can you believe one woman's courage turned a town upside down? Just 24 hours earlier, she had stood up for him when the police tried to intimidate him for nothing more than his leather jacket. Now 200 bikers filled every corner of her struggling diner, and what happened next would change a small town forever, leaving its people in tears and teaching them a lesson in humanity, courage, and respect. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. In the sleepy town of Brooksville, nestled along the winding streets and quiet hills of southern Pennsylvania, there stood a diner that had seen better days. It wasn't much, just an old brick building with neon signs flickering weakly in the night, a place where the coffee was always hot, the eggs always runny, and the customers always seemed to stay a little longer than necessary. Brooklyn's diner was the heart of the community, or at least it used to be. Lisa Thompson, the diner's manager, wiped her hands on her apron as she surveyed the nearly empty room. The chairs and tables were worn from years of use, the kind of wear and tear that only time and a lot of hard work could bring. Lisa had spent the last 15 years of her life behind that counter, a place that had once been a family legacy. Her father had run the diner before her, and when he had suffered a stroke that left him unable to work, Lisa had put aside her career ambitions to take over. It wasn't easy, not by any means, but she had done it out of love for her father and the place that had shaped her childhood. But today, the diner was a far cry from its former self. The economy had hit small towns like Brooksville especially hard, and even the familiar hum of local conversation had begun to die down. The factory that once provided jobs for most of the town had shut down, and with it went the steady stream of customers who filled the diner's booths every morning. Lisa had seen businesses close their doors one by one. Hardware stores, coffee shops, even the small flower shop on Main Street. She couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep the doors open. Outside, the sun had barely begun to rise, casting long shadows on the sidewalks of Brooksville. The town was quiet, as it always was at this time of day. A few cars passed by, but no one seemed to be in any rush. There was a sense of slowness to the place, a lethargy that matched the town's decline. Lisa glanced at the clock above the counter. 8:30 a.m. It wasn't quite time for the breakfast rush, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The diner had only 4 customers seated at the counter, none of whom seemed particularly interested in striking up a conversation. The familiar clink of silverware against plates was the only sound filling the air. She ran her fingers through her brown hair, pushing it out of her face. The morning light caught the edges of her tired features. Her eyes, usually bright and lively, looked heavy, and her cheeks seemed a little more hollow than they had been just a year ago. Her mind raced with the numbers. How much was left in the bank account? How long before she had to close up shop? She hated these thoughts, but they crept into her head like an unwelcome guest sitting at the table with her, refusing to leave. Just as she turned to refill the coffee pot, the bell above the diner's door jingled, signaling the arrival of another customer. Lisa forced a smile, knowing the drill. Whoever walked through the door, she had to serve them with the same warmth she gave to everyone, even if her heart wasn't in it. The man who stepped inside was a mountain of a figure dressed in a worn leather jacket that had clearly seen years of use. His face, partially hidden behind a thick gray beard, was etched with age and experience, the kind of weathered look that told stories without needing to speak a word. Tattoos crawled up his arms, faded but still visible like scars of a long and hard life. Lisa's smile faltered for just a moment, but she caught herself quickly. She could already feel the tension building in the air as the man made his way to the counter. Her customers, the ones who had been sitting quietly until now, stiffened in their seats. Mrs. Pearson, the town's gossip, looked over the top of her glasses. The Simmons brothers, a pair of lifelong residents, exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them said a word. They knew better than to make a scene. The man was clearly a Hell's Angel, a member of a motorcycle club with a reputation that preceded it. There were whispers about their presence in Brooksville, but no one had actually seen one up close until now. The man's boots hit the floor with heavy, deliberate steps as he slid onto a stool at the far end of the counter. He kept his head low, but Lisa could feel his presence. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She steeled herself, forcing a calmness into her voice as she approached. "Good morning," she said, her tone professional but tinged with the faintest hint of hesitation. "What can I get you?" The man looked up at her with tired, bloodshot eyes. "Coffee," he muttered, his voice rough like gravel being ground underfoot. "Black and whatever's quickest from the kitchen. I've been on the road since before sunrise." Lisa nodded, her hand moving instinctively to pour the coffee. She couldn't help but notice the tremor in his hand as he reached for the cup and the hospital bracelet peeking out from under his leather cuff. She didn't need to ask questions. There was something in his demeanor, in the way he held himself, that made it clear he wasn't just any biker. This was a man with a burden, and he was carrying it silently. As she poured the coffee, she looked at the man's face more closely. The lines of age were deep, but there was something else there, something softer, a sadness that couldn't be hidden. Lisa had seen that look before in the eyes of patients she had tended to in her nursing days. It was the look of someone holding vigil, someone waiting for news that could change everything. "You've still got a long ride ahead of you?" she asked, trying to make conversation as her father had taught her to do with every customer, no matter how rough around the edges. The man's gaze flickered for a moment, then he sighed. "Heading to Riverside Hospital," he said slowly, his voice catching just a bit. "My daughter's there. He trailed off, his hands tightening around the mug, his knuckles going white. "She's not doing well." Lisa's heart tightened at the words. She didn't need to know the details, she could see the weight of it in his eyes. Without a word, she turned to place his order in the kitchen, but the tension in the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, each one holding their breath, waiting for her next move. As she returned with the plate of eggs and toast, she noticed the looks of disapproval from her regulars, the ones who had known her since she was a child. They exchanged whispers, their voices barely audible but loud enough for Lisa to catch snippets of their conversation. "The biker," they muttered, "was trouble, his kind always was." But Lisa didn't want to be like them. Her father had always taught her to treat everyone the same, no matter their appearance or their past. She placed the food in front of the man, her voice steady as she asked, "Anything else I can get you?" Before he could respond, two local officers walked into the diner, Officer Clark and Officer Miller. They were regulars at the diner, but Lisa had always found Clark's swagger a little too much for her taste. She could already feel the tension building as they spotted the man at the counter. "Don't often see your kind around here," Clark said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Making no effort to disguise his disdain, the man didn't look up. He kept his focus on his coffee, his hands still trembling slightly as he took another sip, but Lisa could feel the heat rising in her chest. She had seen this kind of thing before, the way people treated those they didn't understand, the way they made assumptions based on appearance alone. "I'm just trying to get some food," the man said softly, his voice low and steady despite the growing tension. Clark didn't let up. "How about we check your ID?" he said, leaning in closer. Lisa's stomach churned. She had seen enough. She couldn't stand by and watch this happen, not when she knew what was at stake. "That's enough," she said, her voice firm and sharp. The words came out before she could stop them. "You're not harassing my customers in here." The diner fell into an uneasy silence. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. What incredible twist will this brave stand lead to? Keep watching on Graceful Valor Stories. The silence that followed Lisa's words was suffocating. Officer Clark's gaze lingered on her, narrowing into a look that mixed surprise and hostility. Lisa could feel the heat of his stare burn through her. She wasn't sure if he was going to back off or escalate things further, but she stood her ground. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. She had been raised to stand up for what was right, no matter the consequences. The whole town might have been whispering behind her back, but she wasn't going to let anyone bully her customers, not even a Hell's Angel, and certainly not a group of local cops who thought their badge gave them the right to decide who deserved respect. "I said, you're done harassing him," Lisa repeated, her voice firm but low with just enough edge to get her point across. The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the officers and the biker. Some seemed to agree with her stance, but many were still hesitant. Lisa could practically feel the weight of their judgment hanging in the air. Mrs. Pearson was clutching her purse tightly, her knuckles white, while the Simmons brothers muttered under their breath, clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. Officer Clark didn't like being challenged, and everyone in the diner knew it. He was known for throwing his weight around, using his position to intimidate anyone who crossed him. It was clear that Lisa was now one of those people. "You're making a mistake, Lisa," Clark finally said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You don't know who this guy is. He's trouble, and trouble brings more trouble. You want that in your diner?" Lisa felt a pang of guilt twist inside her, but she quickly pushed it away. She wasn't just defending the biker, she was defending her dignity, her father's legacy. The diner was more than a business to her, it was a piece of her soul, and she wasn't going to let anyone run it into the ground. "I don't care who he is. He's a paying customer just like you, and if you can't respect that, you can leave." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring them to do something about it. For a moment, the diner felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, Officer Miller, who had been standing silently at Clark's side, took a step back. He gave Lisa a long assessing look before finally nodding and turning towards the door. Clark, however, was not so easily swayed. He stood there for a few seconds, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This town has a way of remembering, Lisa," he said, his voice low, barely audible. The threat was unspoken, but clear. Lisa didn't flinch. "Then I guess you'll remember this," she shot back, her voice unwavering. "Now, are you going to sit down and eat, or are you just going to stand there and cause a scene?" It felt like an eternity, but Clark finally turned and stormed out, his boots thundering against the floor as he left. Miller followed him, shaking his head, muttering something about bad decisions. As the door slammed shut behind them, Lisa let out a long breath. She didn't even realize she'd been holding. The tension in the diner was still thick, but it slowly started to dissipate. The conversations which had paused mid-sentence began to resume, but there was an unspoken awkwardness in the air. Lisa turned back to the biker, who had remained silent through the whole ordeal. He didn't seem shaken or upset by what had happened. He just stared at his coffee, his hands still clutching the mug tightly. There was something in his posture that reminded Lisa of the patients she had cared for in the hospital, the ones whose illness had stolen their ability to speak, but left them with an ocean of unsaid words. The man's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Thanks," he said. His words rough, but there was an unmistakable gratitude in them. "You didn't have to do that." Lisa nodded, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't quite place. It was the right thing to do. Everyone deserves respect. You shouldn't be treated like that just because of a patch on your vest. The man's eyes flickered up to meet hers for the first time, and for a moment, Lisa saw the depth of what he was going through, the exhaustion, the weariness, and the sorrow that weighed down his shoulders. He wasn't just a biker, he was a father, a man who had been fighting battles no one could see, carrying burdens that seemed too heavy for one person to bear. "My name's Ray Mercer," he said, extending his hand across the counter. "I appreciate what you did today." Lisa hesitated for a moment, but then took his hand, surprised by how much strength was in his grip. "Lisa Thompson," she replied softly, "I'm just doing what anyone would." Ray didn't seem to buy that, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave her a tired smile, the kind of smile that said so much without saying anything at all. "Tell you what, I'll take the meal on the house," Lisa said, turning to walk back to the kitchen. But as she did, she noticed the uncomfortable stares of the remaining customers. Some of them were still whispering to one another, casting furtive glances at the biker. Lisa knew what was coming. She could feel the weight of it, the way the town would turn against her for what she had done in a small town like Brooksville. Everyone knew everyone else's business. She had just made herself a target. When she returned to the counter with the bill, the tension had returned. Ray hadn't finished his meal yet, but he was looking around the diner, his expression unreadable. As Lisa placed the bill in front of him, he hesitated for a moment, then looked up at her. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost tentative. "I'm sure," Lisa replied, meeting his gaze with a strength she didn't even realize. She had, "You came in for a meal, and you're not going to pay for something you didn't ask for. That's the way it should be." Ray studied her for a moment, his eyes intense. Then, to Lisa's surprise, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crumpled wad of bills. He didn't leave just the amount for his meal, he left a generous tip, one that spoke volumes. "For your father," he said simply before standing up and walking out of the diner, leaving behind the smell of gasoline and leather in the air. The door jingled behind him, and the diner felt eerily quiet once more. Lisa didn't know what to make of what had just happened. Her heart was still racing, and her hands shook as she tucked the tip into her pocket. It wasn't just the money, it was what it represented: respect, a small act of kindness that had meant more than she could ever put into words. But as she stood there staring at the door where Ray had just exited, she also knew that this was far from over. The town would be talking, and the consequences of her actions would come soon enough. What unexpected support will change everything? Stay tuned on Graceful Valor Stories. The rest of the morning passed in a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Lisa tried to keep herself busy wiping down tables, filling coffee mugs, and arranging the condiments on the counter, but her mind kept drifting back to Ray. She couldn't shake the image of him sitting there alone, a stranger in a small town that didn't want him there. His sadness had seeped into her heart, leaving a mark that wouldn't fade. As the hours went by, the diner remained quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, the laughter of the regulars, it was all gone. It felt like the town had collectively held its breath after Ray left, waiting to see what would happen next. By noon, a thin trickle of customers had come through the door, mostly the elderly, those who had nowhere else to go. Lisa watched them with a sinking heart. They weren't the ones who kept the diner running, they were the remnants of a bygone era. Just like the diner itself, the lunch rush, if it could even be called that, had been dismal. She had already calculated in her head there was no way the diner would make enough today to cover the bills. She went to the back to check the mail, hoping to find something, anything that would give her some hope, but there was only the familiar stack of overdue notices in an envelope from the bank with a large red stamp on the front. "Final notice, not today," she whispered to herself, shoving the envelope back into her bag. She didn't have the strength to deal with it now. Just as she turned back toward the front, the bell above the door jingled again, and Lisa looked up, expecting another customer, but instead she found herself face to face with something she wasn't prepared for. A large sheet of paper had been taped to the front window, the words scrawled hastily in bright red marker, "No biker lovers in Brooksville." It was crude, it was offensive, and it was a clear message that someone was sending her a message she couldn't ignore. Her heart sank as she reached up To pull the sign down, her fingers trembling as she tore it from the glass, she glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching her from across the street. But the sidewalk was empty. She shoved the paper into the trash bin, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. The small town she had once been proud to call home had turned its back on her. When she turned back to the diner, she noticed the looks from the few remaining customers, eyes avoiding hers, lips pressed tightly together, as if they were all in on some unspoken secret she wasn't privy to. It was as if they were all waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to make the wrong move so they could turn their backs completely. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to calm the growing storm in her chest. She had made a choice, she had done what she felt was right, but now the consequences of that choice were beginning to pile up, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. The lunch rush ended, and the diner's bell jingled again. This time, the sound was much sharper, more purposeful. Two familiar figures entered the diner, Officer Clark and Officer Miller. Their presence was enough to make the air feel even heavier. Clark, the larger of the two, had a smug expression on his face like he was walking in with a victory already in hand. Miller, as usual, was silent, his gaze darting nervously around the room. Lisa didn't flinch when they walked in. She didn't even wait for them to sit down, she simply walked straight to the counter, her movements slow and deliberate. She had no intention of making this easy for them. "You're making a mistake," Lisa Clark said as he leaned against the counter, his voice low but filled with that same condescending tone. "You've done something foolish and now you're paying for it." Lisa met his gaze, her heart pounding. "What exactly are you implying, Clark?" Her voice was steady, but inside she was bracing herself for the worst. Clark glanced at Miller, who quickly avoided eye contact. "We've heard the rumors. Lisa, you're protecting a Hell's Angel, a known criminal. Do you think the town's going to forget that?" Lisa's stomach twisted, but she held her ground. "I didn't protect him because of who he was wearing on his vest. I protected him because he was being harassed for no reason. I'm not going to stand by and let that happen, not in my diner." "You think you're some kind of hero now?" Clark scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're just a diner owner. You don't get to make the rules around here." Lisa's hands clenched into fists, but she didn't say a word. There was no use arguing. Clark wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind, and she wasn't going to change it. The two officers lingered for a moment longer before Clark finally tossed a few bills onto the counter, his eyes narrowing as he spoke once more. "Just remember, Lisa," he said, his tone low and threatening, "the town remembers who stands with who, and you're on the wrong side of this." With that, they turned and left, the door jingling loudly behind them. Lisa felt the weight of their words settle over her like a dark cloud, but she refused to let them break her. She couldn't afford to. She took a moment to breathe, then went back to the kitchen to check on the food, but her hands were shaking, and she felt the burn of frustration in her chest. It wasn't just the officers, it was the whole town, the way they had turned on her so quickly, the way they had closed ranks against a woman who had done nothing more than stand up for what was right. It was then that she heard it, the sound of a motorcycle engine approaching. The rumble grew louder as it turned onto the street, and for a brief moment, Lisa thought she might be imagining things, but then the engine stopped, and she saw him, Ray Mercer, and with him were more bikes, more leather, more tattoos, the devil's Nomads. They came in waves, at least 20 bikes roaring through the streets, their riders pulling into the parking lot, spilling over onto the sidewalk. Lisa's heart skipped a beat as the bikers dismounted, their faces lined with determination, their postures ready for anything, but there was no hostility in their eyes, just respect. They were here for her. Ray, looking more at ease than she had seen him before, approached the door. He held it open for the rest of the group, and one by one, the bikers began to fill the diner, taking seats at the counter and in the booths. Their presence was imposing, but there was an unspoken kindness in the way they interacted with each other and with Lisa. "Is there enough room for us?" Lisa Ray asked with a grin, his voice louder now, a stark contrast to the quiet tension that had been hanging over her. Lisa looked around at the bikers, the faces of men and women who had long been misunderstood. For a moment, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. These people weren't here to harm her, they were here to stand by her, to thank her for a simple act of kindness. She smiled, her heart lightening for the first time that day. "I think we can make room," she said, her voice steady but with a warmth that matched the new energy filling the room. And just like that, the diner, which had felt like a ghost town just moments ago, came alive with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the clink of coffee cups race at the counter, and one by one, the bikers placed their orders, each one polite, respectful, and grateful. They didn't need to say much, they had already shown their support. Lisa felt a lump form in her throat as she watched the scene unfold before her. The diner, her father's legacy, was no longer just a place to eat. It had become a symbol of standing up for what was right, of choosing kindness over fear, and of finding solidarity in unexpected places. And as the last of the bikers settled in for a meal, Lisa knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The town may have turned its back on her, but she had something far more important now, a community that had chosen to stand by her, even if it meant challenging the status quo. The diner was filled With a warm energy that Lisa hadn't felt in a long time, as the bikers from the Devil's Nomad settled in, the atmosphere shifted. The usual hum of the diner had returned, but now there was a sense of camaraderie that had been missing for months. Lisa watched as the bikers chatted with the regulars, exchanging stories over coffee, laughing as they shared their lives in a way that was utterly disarming. Mrs. Henderson, who had been the first to look at Ray and his crew with suspicion, was now deep in conversation with a woman in a leather jacket about their shared love of quilting. The Simmons brothers, who had once tensed up at the mere sight of a biker, found themselves talking about old times with one of the writers, a gruff-looking man who turned out to be a Vietnam vet. It was as if the walls that had separated them had come crashing down with a single act of kindness, and in its place, there was something more: understanding. A bridge had been built, and now it was being crossed. Ray sat at the counter sipping his coffee, his eyes scanning the room as he absorbed the atmosphere. The tension that had been etched into his face earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Lisa couldn't help but notice how much lighter he seemed, his shoulders no longer hunched in exhaustion, but relaxed, almost at peace. Lisa approached him, a sense of gratitude filling her chest. She didn't know how to express it, but she had to try. "Ray," she said, her voice softer now, "I don't know how to." "Thank you." Ray looked up at her, his eyes filled with that familiar sadness, but there was something else there, too, something that almost resembled hope. He smiled, but it was a quiet, knowing smile. "You don't have to thank me, Lisa. You did something most people wouldn't. You stood up for someone who didn't deserve to be treated the way he was. You don't see that much anymore, not in towns like this." Lisa's throat tightened as she processed his words. The weight of what she had done, the impact it had had on the community, was only now starting to sink in. She hadn't just defended one man, she had changed the way her town saw itself. She had brought people together, even if only for a moment. "It wasn't about him," Lisa said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was about doing what's right. We can't just sit by and let things happen. I wasn't going to let them treat him like that. He's human, just like everyone else." Ray nodded, his eyes softening as he listened. "You're a good woman, Lisa. You remind me of someone I used to know. Tough, doesn't take any nonsense." Lisa gave a quiet laugh, though it felt heavy with emotion. "I'm not as tough as you think." Ray's smile grew a little wider. "You'd be surprised. It takes a lot of guts to stand up to people like that." Lisa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the room. She watched as the bikers continued to mingle with the locals, the once invisible barriers between them slowly disappearing. The conversations were easy now, filled with the kind of warmth that Lisa hadn't seen in Brooksville for years. The town had been fractured for so long, divided by old prejudices, fears, and misunderstandings, but today, everything felt different. The walls that had stood for so long were crumbling, one act of kindness at a time. Just then, a familiar face appeared at the door. Thomas Mercer, Ray's brother. He stepped into the diner with a slight grimace on his face, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him was a woman with gray hair, her hands clasped tightly together, looking every bit as worried as her husband. Lisa's heart tightened when she saw them. They didn't have to say a word for her to understand what was happening. Ray's face lit up when he saw his brother and his wife. He quickly stood from his seat, walking over to greet them. There was something about the way they interacted, the quiet understanding between them, that made Lisa's heart ache. "Hey, Thomas." Sarah. Ray greeted them with a quiet warmth, but his eyes betrayed the pain he was feeling. "How's she doing?" Thomas shook his head, his face grim. "It's not looking good. She's still fighting, but we don't know how much longer she has. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do." Lisa watched them, the weight of their words pressing down on her. It wasn't hard to see what Ray had been carrying all this time. The sadness in his eyes wasn't just for himself, it was for his daughter, Jessie. His worry, his fear, all of it had been hidden beneath that tough exterior. But here, surrounded by strangers who had become something more, family, even for just a moment, he allowed himself to show a little vulnerability. "I'm so sorry," Lisa said softly, walking over to him. She didn't know what else to say. She wasn't sure there were words for a moment like this. Ray gave a small nod, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She's the strongest person I know," he said, his voice cracking, "but I don't know if she's strong enough for this." Thomas placed a hand on Ray's shoulder, giving him a firm squeeze. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We always do." Lisa stood there unsure of how to comfort them, but then Sarah, Ray's wife, stepped forward. She reached out to Lisa, her hand warm and steady. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for standing up for Ray, for standing up for what's right." Lisa swallowed, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I didn't do anything special," she said, her voice tight. "I just did what felt right." Sarah smiled softly. "You did more than that. You gave us hope, and that's more than anyone could ever ask for." Before Lisa could respond, a new sound broke the quiet, the unmistakable rumble of more motorcycles pulling into the parking lot. This time, there were even more bikes, their engines revving as they parked outside the diner. Ray's face lit up as the door opened, and a group of bikers from the Devil's Nomad stepped inside. They were a mix of men and women, each one wearing the same unmistakable patch on their jackets. One by one, they made their way to the counter, greeting Lisa and the other customers with a mix of politeness and quiet respect. It was clear that the bikers weren't just here for a meal, they were here to show their support for Ray, for Lisa, for the town that had been so quick to turn its back on them, and for the first time in a long time, Lisa felt the warmth of something more than just survival. It was community, it was solidarity, it was the kind of thing that had been lost but had been found again in the most unexpected of places. As the last of the bikers entered, Ray stood up, a determined look crossing his face. He walked over to the door, holding it open for his friends, and Lisa watched as they poured into the diner. "Lisa," Ray said, his voice steady now, filled with a quiet strength, "this place, it's ours now. You don't have to worry about anything, we've got you covered." Lisa felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite place. She had always believed that doing the right thing would eventually pay off, but she hadn't expected this. This feeling of being truly supported was more than she could have ever hoped for. For the first time in months, the weight of the world seemed just a little bit lighter. The diner buzzed with life as the bikers from the Devil's Nomads filled every corner, their laughter and conversation blending with the clink of silverware and the hum of the coffee machine. It was a stark contrast to the silence that had settled over the town just a day ago. The change was palpable, almost miraculous. The town of Brooksville, which had once been a place of division and fear, was slowly learning to see things differently. Lisa stood behind the counter, her hands moving almost mechanically as she served coffee and food, but her mind wasn't on the task at hand. It was on the people sitting in her diner, the ones who had come to support her, the ones who had shown up not just for a meal but for something more important. Her eyes met Ray as he sat at the counter, surrounded by his brothers and sisters in leather, who spoke in low tones but with an air of warmth that Lisa had never seen before. Ray caught her gaze and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod as if to say, "We've got this." Lisa smiled back, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She hadn't known how much she needed this, how much the town needed this until it was happening in front of her. The clock on the wall ticked away, and the hours seemed to slip by unnoticed. More people from Brooksville started to trickle in, cautiously at first, hesitant to step into the diner filled with bikers, but as they saw how the bikers interacted with the staff, how they treated each other, and how the room felt more alive than it had in months, the atmosphere began to shift. Dave Wilson, a local shop owner, was one of the first to enter. He had been a fixture in the town for years, always friendly but always distant from anything that wasn't proper. Today though, he surprised Lisa by sitting at the counter next to a large biker with tattoos of dragons on his forearms. They exchanged pleasantries, and within minutes, they were laughing together like old friends. "Best coffee in town, Lisa," Dave said as he gave her a wave. Lisa didn't know what to say. It wasn't just the compliment that caught her off guard, it was the way he had made an effort to connect with someone he would have never spoken to a week ago. It was the shift in the air. The change was happening slowly but surely. As the evening wore on, the diner became a place of gathering, a place where people from all walks of life, bikers, locals, the old and the young, sat together, shared stories, and broke bread. The fear and tension that had once been so thick in the air were now replaced with something far more powerful: community. Lisa's mind drifted back to the morning, to the moment when she had felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders, the sign on the window, the whispers, the looks, the fear of what might happen to her in the diner her father had built. But now, as she watched the scene unfold before her, she realized something. She had done the right thing. She had stood up for a man who had needed it, and in doing so, she had brought her town back together. She caught a glimpse of Officer Clark standing by the window, his arms crossed, his face tight with disapproval, but there was something different in his posture. He didn't look like he was waiting for a chance to argue or confront her. He simply stood there watching, observing, and for the first time, Lisa saw the cracks in the armor of the man who had once been so sure of himself. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand. Then, as the last of the bikers settled in for the evening, Ray stood up from the counter. He walked over to Lisa, his expression more serious now, the weight of his own personal struggle still lingering in his eyes. "You've done something here, Lisa," he said, his voice soft but full of gratitude. "You've opened up more than just a diner, you've opened people's hearts. I won't forget that." Lisa's throat tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words. She just nodded, letting his words sink in. "I don't know what will happen next, Ray," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside her, "but I know this, for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid. I don't have to fight this alone anymore." Ray reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare softness in his gaze. "You never were alone, Lisa, you just needed to see it. We've got your back now and always." The door jingled again, and for a brief moment, Lisa's heart skipped a beat. But it wasn't more bikers, it was the rest of the town's residents slowly trickling in, drawn by the sounds of laughter and the sight of their neighbors sitting alongside the very people they had once feared. At that moment, Lisa realized that what had started as a single act of kindness, a moment of standing up for one man, had grown into something bigger. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the town of Brooksville, it was about changing hearts and minds. Even when it seemed impossible, it was about proving that one small act could have a ripple effect far greater than anyone could imagine. As the evening wore on, the music played softly in the background, the last plates were cleared away, and Lisa found herself leaning against the counter, looking out over the room. Her heart felt fuller than it had in months. She was no longer just fighting to keep the diner alive, she was fighting to keep the community alive, and in doing so, she had found a new purpose. The bikers, the locals, and even Officer Clark were all part of something that was just beginning to take root in Brooksville. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real, and it was enough. When Ray left for the night, he stopped at the door, turning to give Lisa one last smile. "I'll be back, Lisa, we'll be back, and when we do, you'll know that this diner, it's more than just a stop on the road, it's home." With that, the door closed behind him, and Lisa stood alone for a moment, letting the words wash over her. She was no longer afraid, no longer uncertain. Brooksville had been through a lot, and so had she, but together they would move forward, together they would rebuild, and together they would always remember the day when everything changed. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.